We are very fortunate tonight to have a person who is eminently qualified for his subject, the health problems of the senior citizen. Our speaker tonight was born in Nashville, Tennessee, but he decided not to follow the Grand Ole Opry. Instead, he went to UCLA, where he majored in journalism. After going west to the Pacific Coast, he then obtained a job after his graduation with one of the press organizations with the United Nations. And there he worked for a number of years with the press at United Nations. And the last 2 years that he was there, he was the press officer for Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary of the United Nations. Then Jack Kennedy, when elected president, recruited him to go down with him to Washington to work on a health insurance program. He has been in Washington for 9 years now as Secretary, Executive Director of the Committee for National Health Insurance. And to give you a little background, President Truman, as some of you know, was very eager to get health insurance, a national health insurance program instituted. And our speaker, Mr. Max Fine, has had an opportunity to work in this area with people down in Washington on the various ideas and suggestions that have been made over the years to put together a program of national health insurance that would have an opportunity to do what many people in this country want to have done. As many of you in the audience may know, this program tonight will be magnified at least 24 times throughout the state of Iowa. And one of the things that I'm hoping is that not only will the remarks of our speaker, but the discussion afterward focus on some of the most important points that are now being considered in a national insurance program which President Carter is planning to present to Congress. It's a pleasure to present to you Mr. Max Fine.
Thank you very much, Doctor. It's a pleasure, I think, to be back on a university campus. Not so long ago, I was invited by the Indiana Medical Society and the voluntary health agencies to address a dinner meeting at the University of Notre Dame. And they have, just as you have here, a very beautiful stadium, and they also have an indoor stadium. One side is track and field indoors, and one side is basketball. In the middle is this gorgeous dining area where they had a dinner, and I was the dinner speaker. The chairman of the meeting was the president of the Medical Society, and he introduced me, and I gave my canned speech. And when I'd finished, one fellow at the closest table stood up and said, "I'm Dr. Shelton, and I want to say to you, Mr. Fine, I think you've got a lot of gall coming out here." He said, "Who do you think you are coming into our community and telling us how medical care should be practiced?" He said, "You're trying to intimidate us, and I, for one, won't stand for it." And at this point, the chairman, the president of the Medical Society, leaned over to me and said, "Ignore him, he's a dentist." So, if there are any dentists in the group, I apologize. We can talk afterwards. Just one clarification. I've been in Washington a little longer than 9 years. I've been there since the Kennedy administration. And also, people have been calling me doctor. I haven't achieved such a high academic laurel. They were paging me at the airport, Dr. Max Fine. Not so long ago, I was called by William F. Buckley's producer and asked if I would go on the Buckley Show, firing line. And I said, all right. And he asked me to send him a curriculum vitae, and I did. And he told me at that time that the show would be taped in Erie, Pennsylvania. I said, why? And they said, well, we're also going to have on the show the past president and spokesman for the American Medical Association, Dr. Russell Roth. And of course, I knew that was his hometown. So I said, fine. And they asked me to take a certain plane out of Washington, which landed in Pittsburgh and then went on to Erie, because Mr. Buckley would be on that plane and we'd have a chance to chat before the show. But I took that plane and Mr. Buckley wasn't on it. It landed at Erie, and Dr. Roth was waiting for me. He told me that Mr. Buckley had flown in his private plane from New York, and they'd had a big airport reception, which ended about a half hour previously, and they were all now out at the studio. And he, gentleman that he is, had offered to stay behind and drive me out, and he did. And I saw the sights of Erie, the zoo, and some other things. And we got out to the studio, and the people there were kind of a little bit jittery, and they rushed us into a dressing room, and they put on the makeup, and then they brought us into the broadcast studio. And if any of you have seen that show, you know that the audience sits on the floor on rugs, except for 3 people who sit on chairs just to the right of the stage, because they're going to ask questions right after Mr. Buckley has. Well, there were 3 chairs on the stage, and they put me in the middle one and Dr. Roth on the left. And we sat there under lights much brighter than this, roasting for about 20 minutes, and the perspiration was coming down our face. And finally, Mr. Buckley came in. He said, how do you do? He said, I'm Bill Buckley, nice to know you, nice to know you. And he sat down, and as soon as he sat down, behind the cameras and behind the lights, 60 seconds, and Mr. Buckley had a pad, one of these long, legal yellow pads. And he's looking at it, and he says to me in a whisper, he says, an ophthalmologist. He says, that's not a physician, is it? And I said, oh yes, an ophthalmologist is a physician. I said, perhaps you're thinking of an optometrist. He said, oh. He said, you're from San Francisco? I said, no, I'm from Washington, D.C. He said, you are. And we hear 30 seconds. He says, where did you get your medical degree? I said, I don't have a medical degree. He said, you don't? He says, you were born in Poland? I said, I was born in Nashville, Tennessee. He said, hold it, hold it. And he was very angry, and he ran out that way, and the producer ran after him. And in about 30 seconds, the producer came running back, and he's got a yellow pad. He says, Mr. Fine, can I get some information on you in a hurry? And I said, sure, what do you want to know? And I saw he had written across there, born Nashville, Tennessee. I said, what do you want to know? He said, well, tell me some things about yourself. All right, what do you want to know? He said, well, we haven't got time anyhow. He says, you support labor's health bill, right? And I said, that's right. And he went away. And in another 30 seconds, Mr. Buckley came back, and he sat down. 60 seconds, 30 seconds, the theme music started, the red light went on, and Mr. Buckley's reading from his pad. Says, the Congress is about to debate the issue of national health insurance. The President is going to propose a bill. At the present time, the major bills before the Congress have been developed by the Committee for National Health Insurance and by the American Medical Association. He says, our guests this evening are Dr. Russell F. Roth, a distinguished urologist, former president of the American Medical Association. Dr. Roth is known both in this country and abroad as an outstanding clinician. He's been a leader in medicine for many years. He received his medical degree from Johns Hopkins. He did his undergraduate work at Yale, and so forth. He said, our second guest, and this is on the air, he says, our second guest is Mr. Max Fine of San Francisco, who was born in Nashville, Tennessee, who's here to support Labor's health bill. And for the first time, he looked up from his pad. He looked right at me. He said, now I'd like to ask you the first question, Mr. Roth. That's a true story. If any of you saw that show, the cameraman was kind of confused. So I'm not a physician, and I'm certainly not an ophthalmologist. What I mainly am is a political animal, and I think that's where this whole issue is now, in the political system. We're a nation where more and more people are living to be 65 years or older. An American child born today can expect to live to 71.3 years, 24 years longer than a child born in 1900. By the year 2000, 1 in every 5 people in this country will be 65 years or older. Come along with me, the best is yet to be. Browning wrote that. But can America's elderly of today, or the long living of coming decades, expect the senior years to be the best of their lives? The answer is quite obviously no. Unless we begin now to adapt our society to the era of long life, which is already well underway, the future of aging in America will be bleak indeed, and the senior citizen further debased. The most prized and indispensable resource of each person is health. Health of body, health of mind. We can all fill in the names from our own life experience of persons we have known who attained great success in life only to have the bright promise destroyed by disease or infirmity. And it is the longer living American who most often suffers the great tragedy of poor health combined with poor choices and over-costly methods of care and treatment. Heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, and arthritis occur much more frequently among the over 65 than the under 65 population. Degenerative joint disease strikes more than 50% of the men and women who live to be older than 65. Dental problems are almost universal among the elderly. More than half of the men and nearly 3/4 of the women over 65 have moderate to severe visual impairment. About 30% have some hearing difficulty. 1 in 14 has a severe hearing impairment. Orthopedic defects hamper the lives of 1 out of 5 over 65. 2 out of 5 suffer some limitation due to chronic conditions. Now, I don't want to anesthetize you with statistics, particularly if in earlier sessions these have been brought out, but I don't think it's redundant. I could go on, but I think that this audience is well aware of these appalling health statistics associated with long life. In this case, long life meaning 65 plus. No less distressing are the costs of treatment. You may or may not know that the elderly in America are now spending more out of their own pockets for health care than they did before the start of Medicare and Medicaid in 1966. In the decade ending 1976, total health care costs for the 65 and over population increased from $445 per annum on average to $1,520 per capita. Medicare pays only 43% of the bill, Medicaid 16%. other third-party payers such as Blue Cross, these are those supplementary policies that they sell, 15%. And 26% comes out of the pockets or the meager savings of the elderly. The result, the elderly in 1976 were stuck with $376 in out-of-pocket health care expenditures on the average, as compared with $235 in the year before Medicare and Medicaid began. But averages are for actuaries. You may have heard the story of the actuary who drowned. He was wading across a river that had a sign saying the average height of the water is 3 feet. Medicare was enacted to protect the elderly from the tender mercies of insurance actuaries. That is to say, before Medicare, most often when a person reached age 65 or retired, they lost their health insurance. And one serious illness could wipe out a lifetime of savings, and did, for hundreds of thousands of people. It's been mentioned that I was one of the group that worked to get Medicare enacted. I don't think it's really known what that was all about. What we were trying to do was to enact a program of hospital insurance for the elderly under Social Security. That's what we worked for years. When Wilbur Mills finally agreed to hold hearings under pressure of the President of the United States, 2 years of pressure, we had a party that night to celebrate that he would hold hearings, because he had, before that time, gotten together with Senator Kerr and tried to sidetrack this idea of hospital insurance for the elderly under Social Security by enacting what was called the Kerr-Mills Bill, which was a federal state program with means tests. Only if you could pass a means test and you're over 65, and the state would decide the means levels and would decide the benefit levels, only then could you have entitlement. So you can understand why it was difficult to get him to hold hearings. But what we were trying to do was enact a program under the Social Security program so that everybody over 65 would have hospital insurance. That was the difficult part. And as I said, they were being dropped by private plans. Well, after the assassination of President Kennedy, when it was very clear that President Johnson was going to succeed in enacting this program, it was the first thing that he took up for the fallen leader. At that point, the American Medical Association introduced its alternative. Up to that point, the AMA said there was no problem, we don't need any legislation. They introduced an alternative. They called it elder care. And what happened was that Mr. Mills and the Ways and Means Committee, in those days they met in private sessions, executive sessions. They don't do that anymore. But in executive sessions, I was there, they put together what the chairman, Mr. Mills, came out and held a press conference and called a 3-layer cake. And the 3 layers was what we were trying to get: hospital insurance for the elderly under Social Security. That's now called Part A of Medicare. And layer 2 was what the AMA was trying to get, and that's now called Part B of Medicare. That's where the elderly pay a premium. Originally it was $3, and the government matches that, and they have physician coverage to some extent. And the 3rd layer of the 3-layer cake was the old Kerr-Mills bill, but now expanded not just to the elderly who could prove they were poor, but also to others under a states' rights program, and that's Medicaid. So when you hear about the socializers bringing us this disaster of Medicaid, don't believe it. That's how we got Medicaid. Not that Medicaid has been all bad. It's true. It's a national scandal. It's been ripped off in state after state. But it's provided services to poor people that otherwise wouldn't have gotten them. Well, Medicare was never intended to be a health program. It was always intended to be a humanitarian program, as I've described it. We weren't aware of, frankly, overly concerned about problems of runaway medical costs or disjointed services or lack of access to care or quality controls. We were concerned that people should have protection after working all their lives so that their savings wouldn't be wiped out. And therefore, there was no great outcry when President Johnson agreed with the American Medical Association that Article 1 of Medicare should say nothing in this law will permit any intervention in the present system. No negotiating with anybody about fees and charges and costs. And that's what it says. So Medicare wasn't a health program. But quite obviously, in the decade or so that we've had Medicare, it has certainly exposed problems, perhaps helped to create some of them. And as a result, in the last decade, most Americans have become acutely aware of the problems within the healthcare system itself. Problems not only of skyrocketing costs of hospital services and rapidly increasing costs of physician services, but also of mounting difficulty in access to the wonderful discoveries of modern medical science. The middle class today, many parts of this country, not just the poor, but the middle class. You need an appointment with an ophthalmologist, it's 6 months. And then when you get there, 3 o'clock next April 27th, you discover why they call it the waiting room. Because even though you're paying a handsome fee, you wait well beyond your appointed hour. And this is true of many of the specialty groups, and it's certainly true of the primary care physicians, because we haven't been producing enough primary care physicians while we're producing an oversupply of surgeons and some other super specialists. So the problems, while the costs have been mounting for the average working person, for the middle class person, access has become increasingly more difficult. And that's what's on the minds of a lot of the working people in the unions and in the church groups that support the Committee for National Health Insurance that I happen to work for. Because the American public is increasingly aware of these problems, of costs, no cost controls, quality problems, problems of seeing on television and knowing about marvelous opportunities in medical care, but having great difficulty in achieving these for themselves and their families. Because the American people is increasingly aware of these problems, it does not necessarily herald a concurrent changing of public attitudes. It does not mean that even with respect to meeting health care needs, society has yet begun to adapt to the era of long life for more people. There are economic and social reasons that they should be adapting, but they're not. And it's my thesis that only political action will launch this adaptation, this change that will create a matching instead of a mismatch that we have today, a matching of services for the elderly and the chronically ill according to the needs for services of the elderly and chronically ill. In our present-day society, middle-income families can become paupers overnight when faced with extended nursing home bills for an elderly parent or an elderly member of the family. In the dramas of your own particular lives, I'm sure you can recall, as I can, the examples of dedicated, self-sacrificing individuals in your own home community who literally gave their lives to provide care and medical treatment for family members stricken with some long-lasting illness or incapacitation. And I think most of us can also recall the cases of good people who worked hard and lived thriftily all of their lives, only to find themselves suddenly faced with the twin specters of poor health and financial need in their later years. Nature abhors a vacuum, and in recent years, the nursing home industry has moved in to relieve the self-sacrificing family member, and in many cases, to provide the answer to any remaining family solvency. While housing construction has lagged, proprietary nursing home construction has not. The cost per month average over $600 for each of the 1 million plus residents of skilled nursing homes. The manner in which some get and maintain profits is the focus of some of the more grisly tales in the healthcare field. We all know, or at least should know, how most people feel when they're cajoled, pressured, or arbitrarily committed to a nursing home. They feel it's the beginning of the end, like Farragut in John Cheever's new novel, Falconer, leaving behind forever the only world he'd known, the outside. Nursing homes and other institutions which harbor residents who do not need to be institutionalized are testimonials to rigidities and societal failures. They are a large and growing reality, mainly because we have yet to make the commitment to a more compassionate society for the elderly. This is particularly strange because there is an accumulation of evidence that in the health field, the widespread stimulated development of non-institutional home health and social care services for the elderly and chronically ill would provide far less costly and far more suitable services than nursing homes and other institutions. I was over in England recently, and one of the things that really appealed to me about their National Health Service was, and I just stumbled on it, the neighborhood school, grammar school, served the children lunch from 11:45 to 12:30. And then the elderly from that neighborhood come in and have lunch at the grammar school. Now this is provided for under the National Health Service as the noonday meal for those who want to in that area as part of their system for helping people stay in their own homes. They'll do anything to keep people in their own homes. They'll build an extra room on the house to keep an elderly parent there. And they'll send in the services, Meals on Wheels, somebody to bathe them. They'll do whatever's necessary to keep all those who don't need to be institutionalized at home or in their own apartment. And here we have this tremendous trend to warehousing people and the non-development of the alternative services. Now, many elderly people will require custodial care in nursing homes or other institutions. It's not those people that I have reference to. My point is that alternatives should be readily available for all who do not require nursing home care. However, the range and supply of alternative home-based care are today clearly inadequate. There is in healthcare perhaps a worse mismatch of services in relation to needs of the elderly than even in housing and other human needs. Despite the enormous public and out-of-pocket expenditures for health care for the 65-plus population, the services they need and want, and which are the most appropriate at the lowest costs, are simply not generally available. I do not believe they will become available except under a comprehensive national health insurance program. Such a program can contain provisions for institutional long care for the elderly and other chronically ill persons who need it, coordinated with a broad range of home health and homemaker services, as well as programs of day hospitals that often make it possible for the infirm individual to live in his own home or the home of relatives instead of an institution. It is important to provide preventive services for the elderly as well as for the young. An example of the type of preventive medicine needed by older people is proper vision care. Periodic eye examinations to diagnose and treat conditions of the eye would reveal eye diseases, disorders, and impairments. Among older people, conditions such as glaucoma, forms of eye degeneration, and subnormal vision require early diagnosis and treatment. Instead, we sort of think of elderly people as beyond the pale. President Carter met with the House Committee on Aging the other day and told them that he favors home health care and preventive medicine, and specifically he would prevent institutionalization where possible in the National Health Insurance Plan that he is now developing. The President, the only thing clear in this whole National Health Insurance picture is that the President intends to introduce a bill early next year, probably in February. And he's got a lot of people working on that, and he's got a lot of input from special interests as well as from academicians with no special interest. Now, the details of that bill remain to be filled in, but I thought it was significant that just as he had done in the campaign, in his comments to the House Committee on Aging the other day, he specified support for home care for the elderly and for preventing institutionalization where necessary. The real battle in national health insurance is going to be over whether the concepts and ideas that are embodied in those bills which say that health care should be a right are accepted in the President's program and therefore have a chance in the Congress, or whether the principles of risk insurance will be maintained. And the difference is, well, I guess the easiest way to discuss the difference would be to describe those bills before the Congress that rely on risk insurance and the one bill that would implement the principle of health care as a right. There are really two major bills that would perpetuate risk insurance. One of them, you may have noticed that the American Medical Association at its recent convention decided, despite an attack from the less enlightened in the AMA, which sought to have them scuttle the bill, decided to reintroduce a bill that they had introduced in the last Congress. Now, I think in this bill, the AMA has really risen above principle, because their bill recognizes that people in this country, despite all the propaganda on the airwaves, on television, of the insurance industry, all the propaganda about we don't need anything because we have all this health insurance in force today, the AMA recognizes that we don't have enough insurance in force. And they have a bill that asks the Congress to pass a law that would require every employer in America to offer his or her employee a private health insurance policy. And the employer would have to pay 65% of the premium costs. Now, for the poor, they have a rather intricate and involved system of means tests based upon tax liability. If you're poor, under the AMA's approach, you could fit in any one of 91 categories. There are 91 categories of poor. And it says if you have a tax liability of 0, and you're so poor that you don't pay any taxes at all, that the government would give you the money to buy the premium from the insurance company. But if you have any tax liability whatsoever, then you have to pay part of the premium, up to 90% of the premium, based upon your tax liability. So there are 91 categories. Now, as I say, for the AMA, that's progress. There's another point in the AMA's bill that's progress, and that is that they've always said that we have to have deductibles, because if you don't have deductibles, patients will swamp doctors' offices. They'll just overrun the doctors. I don't really know where they get the idea that people just love to go to the doctor and dentist. Sure, there are hypochondriacs, but most people would just as soon not go, or more over, would appreciate not having to go. So despite the many years of AMA position that you needed deductibles, in their bill there's no deductibles. They do have cost sharing. As you go along, you pay a certain amount as a certain percentage, but there are no deductibles. So for the AMA, that's progress, as I say. But in the AMA bill, there are no cost controls. There are no quality controls. There are no changes in a system that has produced a medical malpractice insurance crisis. It's as if they're saying, we want great changes, but we want nothing new. That, I believe, will represent sort of the right parameter of what emerges. The other bill that relies on, continues to rely on the risk insurance principle, has a lot of support in the Congress. Its sponsor is Senator Russell Long, who is the chairman of the Finance Committee, just as powerful today as Wilbur Mills used to be in the House Ways and Means Committee. His bill, which is supported by a lot of conservative economists, is based on the principle and philosophy that people ought to be made more cost conscious. That when we pay first dollars coverage for health, people abuse the system. And really the only way to get away from that is to make the individual more cost conscious. So his bill is called catastrophic health insurance. And his bill says that you pay for the first 60 days in the hospital. You'd be plenty cost conscious by the time you pay that. And moreover, that you pay for the first $2,000 in physician's fees. And after that, the insurance plan would provide the benefits. Of course, that totally overlooks the point that patients can be as cost-conscious as I am, and I'm very cost-conscious. But it's the doctor. It's the doctor who decides to admit you to the hospital. It's the doctor who decides what services to order and what x-rays and lab tests. And it's the doctor who decides when to discharge. So making the patient more cost-conscious hardly seems a solution to the problem, because after all, the biggest problem that's causing the legislative process to get moving on national health insurance are costs that the patient is already conscious of. That's why consumer organizations started the drive for national health insurance. Senator Long's bill would make it almost illegal for anybody under $25,000 income to get sick, because that's about what it would add up to in terms of, if you didn't have that much income, you'd be bankrupt before you got any benefits. Those programs and others introduced by the insurance industry, soon to be introduced by the American Hospital Association, and already there are a dozen bills in the hopper, all of those programs maintain the idea of risk insurance in health. Now, I think risk insurance works very well for insuring your boat, for insuring your house, for insuring your life so that your family's protected. But it simply doesn't work in health. On the one hand, everybody's trying to encourage preventive medicine, immunizations, pap smears, the checkups. Everybody's trying to encourage that rhetorically. On the other hand, risk insurance says we're not going to provide any benefits for that, because risk insurance means there's a large group and some ill happening will befall a few in that group. And that's what insurance is, to protect that few. And it goes totally against the grain of risk insurance to provide benefits for preventive medicine or anything else that would cause you to use the insurance. A cardinal principle of risk insurance is that you should have no control over access to insurance benefits. Now, all these things that I'm saying, when the insurance industry testifies before Congress, they say as well. We believe that great reforms are necessary. We believe there ought to be more preventive medicine. And the way to get it is to continue to encourage competition among the insurance companies so that they will continue to provide a variety of different kinds of policies and different kinds of coverages, which incidentally nobody can understand. I've been in this field for a good many years, and I know more than the next person about the actuarial value of a health insurance policy, but I can't tell you which is worth more if I spent all night examining 3 different policies. You can't understand them unless you understand hieroglyphics or Chinese. A cardinal principle is an anathema to the idea of insurance, is an anathema to the idea of preventive medicine. So when the president of one of the largest insurance companies is asked by the Congress, well, do you or do you not believe that health care should be a right, that people should have health insurance, whatever, and the only condition should be that they need the care, that there shouldn't be conditions of you have to be employed in order to get insurance from your employer, or you have to be well enough so the company will sell you a policy, no pre-existing conditions. Do you believe that health care is a right? That everybody should be entitled to the care they need? And he said, I sure do, so long as they can pay for it. Every industrial country in the world except 2, 61 industrial countries, already have national health insurance plans. The only 2 that do not are the United States and the Union of South Africa. That's not the company we ought to be in. I'm not saying that we ought to replicate the health insurance plan or the National Health Service of any other country. I think that there's a lot we can learn from some other countries, particularly Canada. I think the demographic characteristics of the Canadians are very much like Americans. They've had 10 years now of a national health insurance plan. They've got the bugs worked out. They've got a system that 86% of the people like, and incidentally, so does the Medical Association, which fought it. They wouldn't go back to the old system. I don't think even the Canadian system should be the model for our country. I think that there are, particularly in this area, of enriched development of home services, more like what they've done in Germany and in England, that we can adapt not from Canada's program, but from some others, and not adapt exactly. What I'm saying is that there is a great deal of experience in other countries, and we can benefit from it. We can benefit from the mistakes we've made in this country, in Medicare and Medicaid and Blue Cross and Blue Shield. There are 1,800 insurance companies selling health insurance. That's a mistake all by itself. The fastest growing item in the entire cost of living is not oil costs, is not hospital costs. Hospitals are second. The fastest growing item is Blue Cross and Blue Shield and commercial health insurance premiums. They went up 30% last year, 28% the year before. Last year we paid the health insurance companies in this country last year, for every $100 that they paid to doctors in benefits with our premiums, they paid themselves $53, over $53. That's how much it's costing us. That's how much is not getting into the health system. It added up to $5.5 billion in the difference between their premium intake for health insurance and what they pay out in benefits. The rest are their operating expenses, advertising costs, acquisition costs, profits. I wouldn't have any quarrel with that if the system was working well, if there was universal coverage. But after 40 years, they failed to provide universal coverage. There's still 40 million people with no coverage. And the benefits that are provided are only covering 40% of the costs of those with the insurance. And certainly in the area of development, resource development of necessary resources, they've failed completely. Instead of that $5 billion going for all of these acquisition costs, it ought to be going into development of the kinds of home health and social care services that are desperately needed in this country. And I believe that President Carter will give these concepts that I'm talking about the kind of leadership and support that will achieve a comprehensive national health insurance plan. I think if you study the history of important domestic legislation in this country, you will find that there's never been any until you have four elements in place. First is the active leadership and strong support of the President of the United States. You know, Theodore Roosevelt called the White House the bully pulpit. And by that he meant that only the President, through his command of patronage, through his ability to capture the media, they didn't call it media in those days, but through his ability to capture the media when he wants to, through his ability, and only his ability, to educate the American people about issues. Only the president in our society has the capability of leading the nation forward on important social legislation. But even with the president, it was mentioned that Harry Truman tried very hard to get national health insurance. In his book, he wrote that was his greatest disappointment. He was very bitter about that. He wrote about how the AMA had hired a public relations organization in San Francisco named Whitaker and Baxter, and how they had succeeded in defeating him with scare words. They coined the word socialized medicine. Most people don't know what that means, but it worked. But even with the president's leadership, you need more. The second thing you need is the high priority interest of leading members of the Congress. Now, in the bill that our committee developed and supports, the Health Security Bill, the Kennedy-Corman bill, there are more than 100 members of the Congress who are supporting that, including most of the leaders. We would hope that that kind of political support will be noticeable to those in the White House who are developing the president's plan, and that its concepts, if not its details, will be embodied in what the administration produces. Its basic concept is that health care ought to be a right and not tied to employment, not tied to means tests, not tied to work earnings tests, not tied to anything except the need for care, with great emphasis on prevention, early diagnosis of disease, as well as rehabilitation, and with a special resources development fund made up of what we would otherwise pay to the Blue Cross and the Blue Shield and the other insurance companies for the development of the kinds of services, particularly for the chronically ill and elderly, that we've been talking about. The third thing history would inform us that is essential is the support of private organizations. In this case, the constituency for national health insurance is very broad. It includes, it's the one issue in which all of the labor unions agree. There's no difference between the Teamsters and the auto workers, or the AFL-CIO or the mine workers. They're all supported. It's an issue that is growing in importance among most of the church groups. On September 29th in Washington, D.C., in that park, Lafayette Park, right across from the White House, there's an interreligious gathering of a massive nature on health care must be a right. And they have something like 50 bishops and leaders from all over the country from most of the church groups on this issue. I think the church groups are beginning to see this issue much like they saw civil rights 15 years ago. And of course, the fourth thing that you need, and that Harry Truman didn't have and didn't develop, was an active grassroots demand. The polls, Harris and Gallup and Cambridge and Roper, with one exception, that exception was a paid-for poll, but the polls all show that 2/3 of the American people favor national health insurance, comprehensive national health insurance. Now, that isn't to say that they favor all the details of the Kennedy-Corman bill or any other bill, but it does show a degree of dissatisfaction, either with costs or with access or with whatever, that is very pronounced and that will be in my opinion, a telling component in the legislative process. During the campaign last year, Jimmy Carter, on 3 occasions, promised comprehensive national health insurance. John L. Lewis said that pre-election promises presuppose post-election good faith. The reason I know that is that Carter said that. I looked it up, it was accurate. I think, and we'll all see together, but I think that literally after a half a century, more than a half a century, that this administration will produce such a bill. You know, they've had national health insurance in Germany since Bismarck's time. The first president to propose it in this country was Theodore Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt tried to get it and didn't succeed. Harry Truman didn't succeed. Carter says, as he recalls all of this, that he intends to get it. I think that it's important that you and anyone else who has an interest in this field write to the president. The address is the White House, Washington, D.C., 20050, and tell him what you think. Tell him what you think ought to be in a national health bill, or tell him what you think shouldn't be in a bill. I would hope that you would direct at least part of your letter to the problem of the elderly and the chronically ill, because there is a terrible mismatch of available services in terms of the needs of the elderly. I remember the late Senator Everett Dirksen used to tell a story about not knowing what he should get his wife for some anniversary, 40th anniversary. And he was passing a pet shop, and he saw some puppies in the window, and he walked in, and there he saw the perfect gift, a mynah bird. So he told the proprietor, deliver it to my house, 5:30. My wife won't be getting home till after that. I want to be there to receive it. I want to surprise her. But he was delayed in the Senate, and he didn't get home until 6:30. And he rushed into the house, and his wife was standing there. He said, did you see the bird? She said, yes. He said, where is it? She said, it's in the oven. And he raced back to the kitchen, and he opened the oven door, and there's the bird roasting. He said, my God, he said, that bird could speak 6 languages. And she said, why didn't he speak up? He had time. I think that's an appropriate closing. I think there's time, but I think those who are genuinely and seriously concerned with this problem, and in particular, the problem of the health needs of the elderly and the chronically ill, you have time, but not a heck of a lot of time. I think President Carter is going to be making some decisions relatively soon if he indeed is going to introduce a bill early next year, and I think he is going to do that. Thank you very much.